Now it's okay. Debbie thwarted my introduction by saying K when she didn't mean K, but now she means K. All right. Good morning, everybody. It's good to see you here today, and I'm really thankful for the folks that are joining us online as well. We're going to continue talking about spiritual warfare today, talking about the enemy. And for the past couple weeks, we've been looking at his names, really kind of wrapping our noodles around that these names aren't really names, but they're job descriptions. They are the titles of what he does and how he operates. And today we're going to take a little bit of time looking, well, I say a little bit, it will probably be 2 Sundays, looking at origins and end of the devil. So let's take a moment and pray together, and then we'll dive into our study today. Gracious God, thank you so much for the opportunity that we have to come together and worship you. Father, we lift up those who are not able to join us today, some because of health reasons, others because of events in their lives. And gracious one, I pray that you would keep your hands upon them and richly bless them. Father, I pray that you would open our eyes today, open our hearts, open our understanding, and help us, Lord, as we study to not give the devil more attention than he is due, but help us, Lord, to understand so that we may steer clear of his snares. In Jesus' name, amen. All righty. So we have a little opening paragraph there. You may be wondering about one of the names of the devil. Why haven't we mentioned Lucifer? Has anybody wondered? Hey, we talked about Satan and Belial, and we have the devil and Beelzebub. How come we didn't talk about Lucifer? Many Christians consider Lucifer to be Satan's name before he fell. And so let's find out why. So, what we're going to do is we're going to read in Isaiah chapter 14, verses 12 through 19. Isaiah 14, verses 12 through 19. And what we're going to be reading is a portion of a taunt against Babylon, or the king of Babylon. And here's what it says in 12 through 19. How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven above the stars of God. I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to Sheol, to the far reaches of the pit. Those who see you will stare at you and ponder over you. Is this the man who made the earth tremble, who shook kingdoms, who made the world like a desert and overthrew its cities, who did not let his prisoners go home? All the kings of the nations lie in glory, each in his own tomb. But you are cast out away from your grave like a loathed branch, clothed with the slain, those pierced by the sword, who go down to the stones of the pit like a dead body trampled underfoot. And we'll stop there. You probably could read a little bit less. Depending on the references you find, you might read a little bit less. You might read a little bit more in this taunt to kind of grab a hold of what one of the two, perhaps three texts in the Bible that are considered to be the origin of the devil. So why would a taunt against the king of Babylon contain a taunt, as it were, against the devil? Anybody have any ideas? Well, that's basically it, right? Tony says that because they they viewed Babylon as doing the devil's work, and so you kind of have, we want to be thinking about this when we are considering spiritual warfare, right? This is a big study about spiritual warfare. And remember what we read about when the Apostle Paul says our enemies are flesh and blood, right? But they're the powers behind the flesh and blood. So when Christians are attacked, when we are taunted, when we're made fun of, when we're persecuted, whatever it is, that even though there's a human that is doing that, ultimately what's behind the human doing that, behind the power of the human doing that, is not strictly that human and their will, but also some pokes and some proddings, bare minimum, of the evil one. And so even when Peter says, when Jesus says that he's going to be killed, right? Peter says, "No, not you." Right? That's not going to happen to you. And Jesus says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." Right? "Get behind me, adversary. Get behind me, evil one. Get behind me, slanderer." He's not necessarily calling Peter the devil, but he's recognizing that behind Peter's statement is the very temptation that has seized Jesus all along. And that is to skirt the cross, to find a way around the cross. And so Jesus comes, it seems like he comes down really hard on Peter, and I strongly recommend against anybody calling another Christian the devil. But the idea being that Jesus has is that behind that power, behind that statement, is the very work of the devil. So although Babylon is being used as a tool of God to punish Israel and Judah for their failure to be faithful, this is specifically Judah, failure to be faithful to God, right? This is the punishment that they deserved. Even still, this is really something that's pretty awesome if you consider this. Judah has been unfaithful. God is righteously sending Babylon to conquer Judah. And then God is going to punish Babylon for doing evil to his people. Because God is simply allowing these people to do what is, and they're in their nature, what's already part of what they would normally do. But now the devil is looking and saying, "Oh, we can destroy God's people. I can wipe out the witness of God's people. I can make them a laughing stock." So the whole time that when God created Israel, he created them to be a beacon in the middle, what we would call today the Middle East, of faithfulness to God, of right living, so that the nations around would say, "We've been doing it wrong all along. We should live like Israel." Well, how do we live like Israel? Let's go find out. And look what happened early on in Solomon's reign. The people, or I should say, consider what happened early on in Solomon's reign. The people from around the world, around the known world, sent emissaries to Solomon to get his wisdom and then go bring that back to their nations. It was exactly what God had wanted, was for the people of the ancient world to notice and come and look. Not saying that Solomon necessarily handled it correctly, but the mission for Israel is the same as the mission for the church. So also the mission for the devil against Israel is the same as the mission of the devil against the church: make Israel ineffective. So Israel is constantly tempted and tempted and tempted. They end up having a civil war. They split. Israel goes to the north, Judah to the south. The devil leads Israel, the northern kingdom, into more and more temptation. They become a laughing stock, and following just a few steps behind is Judah, doing the same thing, laughing stock to the world around them. You sit down and you read the prophets, and you hear that they're a laughing stock. So then Babylon, well, first Assyria to the north, and then Babylon come and attack the south with the devil's urging. Now, not only are they a laughing stock, but they're a defeated laughing stock. Where's your God now? And the devil can laugh and say, see, I defeated you again. Your people won't follow you. Your people won't listen. Very similar, if you think about it, to what the devil's trying to get across in the book of Job, chapter 1. But then ultimately, God will raise up a remnant, and those that had attacked his people, they become the laughing stock. And that's kind of the story of kind of behind the scenes for what's going on with Babylon. And also the same thing happens with Assyria and later with Persia, and even with the Greek domination of the Middle East, and even the Roman domination of Israel later on. So do you see how this is a text that talks about Lucifer? I bet you don't. Yes? Let's hear it, Hillary. Yep. Yep. Morning star, son of dawn. We are going to dive into that. We're going to see that pop up quite a bit. So if you were to have a King James Bible and you read verse 12 in the King James Bible, it reads this way: How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? You have a King James Bible? Okay. O Lucifer, son of the morning. How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? That's how that verse reads. Verse 12. The name Lucifer is only found in the King James, and only this one time. It is derived from the Latin word Lucifero, which means light bearer, sometimes called the morning star. And if you were to get into some medieval reading or Renaissance reading, you would learn that Lucifero, the morning star, the light bearer, Lucifero, the light bearer, referred to the morning star, which is Venus. If you ever get up early enough in the morning to see a very bright star that is on its way down in the morning, it's getting ready to set, that's Venus. It's what are called the inferior planets. The inferior planets are the planets between Earth and the sun, and the only time you see the inferior planets is near sunset or sunrise. And they're, because they're so close to us, and because they're so close to the sun, they're very bright. So Mercury is harder to see, but Venus often is quite bright when you see it, because it's so close to the sun that it reflects an awful lot of light back at us. So here's the thing. Lucifer is not actually a biblical name of the devil. The word, there's a Hebrew word that's there that is Hellel, which means kind of like bearer or bright one, and that is the word that's there. Doesn't necessarily mean Lucifer alone, and we're going to see as we read in some more texts kind of the implication of that. However, we do see some things here as you look at these verses, these 7 verses. I think you see some things that can't possibly refer to the king of Babylon himself, but must refer to another being of some kind, right? Where we see, that it's called the day star, or the star of the son of the dawn, ascending to the heaven above the stars of God. In verse 13, I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of the assembly in the far reaches of the north, right? Consider north up and far away. And just like a mountaintop is high and far away, the heavens are high and far away, ascending above the heights of the clouds. All those kinds of statements are statements of the heavenlies. and certainly no king of Babylon ever ascended above the clouds, right? He just might have considered himself to be there. And so, for some of those reasons, many people have interpreted this text to be referring to some kind of origin of the devil. So, as you look at these, what themes do you see present? So, if you look at verse 12, what theme do you see there? Or do you see a theme in verse 12? Sorry? Being defeated. Yeah, you see there is a line of defeat. You have that kind of how you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of the dawn, how you are cut down to the ground. You who laid the nations low. Yeah, there's definitely a tone of defeat. And in that, there's also a tone of past glory, right? To be referring to this being as the morning star, or the right, day star, son of the dawn. That does seem to have a sense of glory to it. Oh gosh, yeah. Yes, yes. So Tony said, "Would you say there's a tone of sarcasm?" And honestly, if when you sit down and you read the prophets, um, there is an awful lot of sarcasm that is present in the text. Sometimes I think we miss it depending on how we intone our intonations when we read. But I think if you sit down and you look at it, you're like, oh, there's a little bit of sarcasm going on here. Yeah, God seems to use sarcasm quite a bit, especially when in these kinds of statements, these laments, or this is actually this is considered to be a taunt. So with a taunt, right, you're making fun of somebody, encouraging them to make themselves look even more foolish. That's really what a taunt is, and so you would expect sarcasm there. Yeah. How about in verses 13 and 14? What do you see for a theme in verses 13 and 14? A what? You see a promise in 13 and 14? Oh, like he was making a promise. Right. Yeah. So what was the promise made based upon? Yeah, which kind of seems like a bit a we might consider a personality flaw. Would you see pride here? Pride. So if you want to, you can write pride on your paper in all capital letters. If you want to sound fancy, you can write hubris, which is means a lot of pride. Real, a lot of pride. So you could write hubris in there, or you could write pride, verses 13 and 14. And how about verses 15 through 19? You see defeat. Um, do you have a word of well, if you look at this, and I think you're right. I think you're right, Greg, that we are talking about defeat, but we're not talking about any old defeat. I think if you look at this, verses 15 through 19, you are brought down to Sheol. Sheol is the Hebrew word for the grave, and often it gets just transliterated for us right to Sheol, because it it comes with it a symbolism of not just the hole in the ground where your body gets buried, but of an entirety of an afterlife. Not just the grave, but punishment, torment, separation from God, loneliness. And those who stare at you and ponder over you, is this the man who made the earth tremble? Who shook kingdoms? Who made the world like a desert and overthrew its cities? Who did not let his prisoners go home? Is this that guy? All the kings of the nations lie in glory, each in his own tomb, but you are cast out away from the grave, or I'm sorry, away from your grave, like a loathed branch, clothed with the slain, those pierced by the sword, who go down to the stones of the pit, like a dead body trampled underfoot. So think about the Middle East. If you think about the Middle East, you think about the lands of the Bible, how often do you picture in your noodle the pyramids? You don't picture the pyramids at all. You don't picture, oh my goodness, I'm in a world of my own. I just think of the whole thing, and the pyramids stick out in my mind because the pyramids are like these great big symbols. If we think about Egypt, you're certainly going to think of the pyramids, I would think. And the pyramids are these great, all they really are is great big headstones. Really big headstones that you can see for miles and miles away. And at one time, underneath these enormous buildings, these piles of stone shaped like great big three-dimensional triangles, were the remains of a king, a number of servants slain with him, possibly buried in order to serve him in the afterlife, and an enormous amount of treasure that was put in there, riches. And these kings spent a good chunk of their reign spending their money on what their grave would look like. Used all these servants, came up with, a lot of the ways that these pyramids were built, there were real innovations made in science at the time in order to build an elaborate grave marker, an elaborate headstone, so that everybody knew that under that pyramid lay a great king. Not so this king. Think about the pomp that we have in our country when a former president passes away. Or in other nations when a former king dies. And around the Middle East, there are all kinds of tombs and edifices made for dead kings. They're laid in beautiful places, and things are erected over and around them to mark, here's where the king is. Not so this guy. So it's not just defeat, but I see here also humiliation. Humiliation, so that you have once in glory, glorified being, because of pride based upon that glory, based upon his own opinion or its own opinion of that glory, suffers defeat and utter humiliation. Those are really the three themes that we see here. And by the way, commercial plug, stick around for the sermon today. God's doing one of those things where he's going to lay things out so that they're parallel and in order for us. I think he's trying to tell us something. So let's take a little peek over at any questions about that. And yes. Is it punishment, or does God just let the devil mire in his own muck? Yes. 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 The best consequences for a person's actions or a being's actions is, basically, the best punishment for a person or a being is allowing them to deal with the real life consequences of their actions, right? The real life consequences. When we were kids, I can remember my brother went up to his friend's house. My brother was a very active child. Like it turns out I was, well, they just called us hyperactive back in the day, right? I was a hyperactive kid, but nobody noticed it because my brother was like a super ball. Remember super balls? Bing, you bounce, ding, 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 bounce all over the place. That was Keith, super ball all over the place. And he went up to his friend's house one day and for whatever reason decided to throw a ball in the house at his friend's house. And they had beautiful French doors on the front and just right through the glass, right through it. And, my dad got a call, my parents got a call, and my dad said, okay, I'll come and pick Keith up. And he went up and he picked Keith up and he said, we'll be back in a few hours. And took Keith to the hardware store and said, so your allowance that you were going to get for the next number of weeks, you're not getting it. Because I'm putting this money right down right now to buy some cut glass and to buy, now I can't think of the word, the glazing that would go around. And we're getting some paint. And you are learning how to fix a window. And so Keith had the real life consequence of, you're doing all your chores. Believe you me, you're doing all your chores and you're getting no allowance. And then you're going up to and by the way, you also have to deliver quite an apology to the their last name was Wardrop, to the Wardrops. And then you're taking me, my dad, away from the things that I needed to do today. So you're also helping me with those. And we're going to go fix that window. Guess what Keith never did again? He never threw a ball in the house. Now, there was a time he brought the hose in the house, and we had a bit of a water fight. Entirely different story and results. But he never threw a ball in the house again. Much better than you're grounded, right? Or back in the 70s, you could do it. 80, I guess it was early 80s. Whack on the backside. Nope. Real life consequences. God, in his grace, doesn't always, or mercy, but often allows us to deal with the real life consequences of our actions. And the real life consequences of our actions are the best way to teach us, don't do that again. And so the devil, if this text is about the devil, and I tend to think that it is, and most Christians tend to think that it is dealing with the real life consequences of his actions. He's cast out of glory. And ultimately, his end will be great humiliation. And there is nothing worse for a person filled with pride than humiliation. So let's take a little peek over at Job chapter 38, verses 1 through 7. And I'm going the wrong way. So this is beginning. Job 38 is the beginning. If you are familiar with the book of Job, you would know that for the vast majority of the book of Job, Job and his three and then fourth friend are arguing back and forth for the most part about that Job has done something wrong and therefore he is being righteously punished for what he's done. Job is saying he's innocent. He has not done anything that would lead to this, and that he demands a response from God. God, you tell me why you're doing this to me, because it's not right. And all of his three of his friends are saying, well, you've done wrong, and that's why this is happening. And finally, the fourth friend shows up, and he says, I'm not hearing any wisdom here, effectively. So let's take a little peek here at chapter 38, verses 1 through 7. The Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, by the way, bad, okay? The storm, what are called storm theophanies. A theophany is a fancy Bible word for an appearance of God. A storm it is never good to have a storm theophany. Storm theophanies are always God is angry. Always God is angry. As a matter of fact, in the book of Genesis, in chapter 3, after Adam and Eve sin, it says that most of our English translations will translate that God was walking through the garden in the cool of the day. And several Bible scholars consider a better translation to be God was walking through the garden in the calm before the storm. Because then God turns and says, Adam, where are you? I'm hiding. Why? Well, as I thought you might see me, and I was embarrassed because I was naked. Who told you you were naked? Right? It's not, oh, who told you you were naked? We're about to see God rain punishment down on his creation. And so that calm before the storm makes an awful lot of sense. And so here we have the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. There's been no mention of a whirlwind to this point. Who is this that darkens my counsel without, by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you will make it known to me. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. There's your sarcasm, Tony. This drips with sarcasm, right? Drips with sarcasm. So check this. Do you see anything here that might catch your attention back to Isaiah chapter 14, particularly in verse 7? Check out in verse 7, God says, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Remember that in Hebrew, you don't make rhymes when you do poetry, right? Because every fourth word rhymes. They only certain number of they used endings to determine the gender of a word, the number of a word, the place that it sat in the sentence and all that. So there are these repeated, I mean, it's more than four endings, but there were repeated endings all over the place. It is easy to rhyme in Hebrew, like it's easy to rhyme in most languages. English, we use rhyme as a means of something beautiful to do in poetry because it's more difficult to do in English. In languages that are gender-based languages, male or female, or that the way that plurality might be shown, or that a verb's place or even a noun's place in a sentence are shown, where they have certain endings that get used. Rhyme's too easy. So in Hebrew, one of the things that gets done is parallelism. The same thing gets said a couple of times and in different ways, so that when you hear the morning stars sang together and the sons of God shouted for joy, that it is very, very, very unlikely that God is saying two different groups, speaking about two different groups, the sons of God and the morning stars. He's speaking about the same group. And there are times in the Bible where where sons of God is possibly a reference to angels when it's used in a plural manner, sons of God, as a reference to angels. Not always, but sometimes. And then look at here, morning stars. Quite likely a reference to angels. And possibly if you flipped open a Vulgate, that's a Latin version of the Old Testament, you'd find Lucifere mentioned here, right? In light bearers, morning stars. That this term to use morning star or stars is a very common Hebrew understanding of angels. As a matter of fact, in the ancient world, and in the ancient Near East, when they looked at the sky at nighttime, they believed they were seeing into the highest, or they were seeing into the second heaven. I guess no, they were seeing the third heaven. So the first heaven is the sky that we see in the daytime. And then existing above that, you have the cloud, the sun and the moon. And then at nighttime, when the sun descends, and you can see further, and you can see to where the gods live. And they believed that they were looking at the gods in the heavens above when they looked at the stars. Don't believe me? Think about all your constellations. How many of the constellations that the Greeks used were their heroes and their gods up in the sky. That's what they believed they were looking at. Well, the Jews didn't believe that they were looking at all this panoply of deities up in the sky. They believed they were seeing the heavenly host, the armies of God. So that when you go back to that Isaiah passage and you see a singular star of the morning, it almost makes sense that it could be speaking to a singular angel among all of the stars of the morning, or all of the stars in the sky, all of the angels. Does that make sense? We take some of these things into account. So basically mixed into God's reproval of Job, his correction of Job, as he asks Job if he was there when God created the world, is a mention of angelic beings. Some even considering it to be some even consider that text to be talking about the creation of the angels. That God's talking about the creation of the earth, and then mention these sons of God, these stars of the morning, that this could also be when he's basically saying to Job, were you there when I created the angels? Tell me how I did it. God's whole thing to Job in these couple of chapters is basically, if you can tell me how I created the world, or how I created the angels, or how a doe knows when it's time to mate, or the birds know what direction to fly, or if you can put a hook in the mouth of a whale and pull him up out of the sea, if you can do any of those things, then you tell me, and then you can understand why these things happened in your life. Otherwise, your brain's not big enough. That's how those chapters go. So let's jump over now to Ezekiel chapter 28, verses 12 through 19. Ezekiel 28, 12 through 19. So this is a lament over the king of Tyre, king of Tyre. So we'll see how this goes here as we read it. So we're going to read verses 12 through 19. Son of man, raise a lamentation over the king of Tyre, and say to him, Thus says the Lord God. You were the signet of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering: sardius, topaz, and diamond, beryl, onyx, and jasper, sapphire, emerald, and carbuncle, and crafted in gold were your settings and your engravings. On the day that you were created, they were prepared. You were an anointed guardian cherub. I placed you. You were on the holy mountain of God. In the midst of the stones of fire, you walked. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created till unrighteousness was found in you. In the abundance of your trade, you were filled with violence in your midst, and you sinned. So I cast you as a profane thing from the mountain of God, and I destroyed you, O guardian cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. Your heart was proud because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. I cast you to the ground. I exposed you before kings to feast their eyes on you. By the multitude of your iniquities, in the unrighteousness of your trade, you profaned your sanctuaries. So I brought fire out from your midst. It consumed you. And I turned you to ashes on the earth, in the sight of all who saw you. All who know you among the peoples are appalled at you. You have come to a dreadful end, and shall know, and shall be no more forever. So, one word answer. Does this sound to you like a mortal king? No. In Eden? Clothed in all those gems and gold and engraved and all kinds of stuff, and entirely blameless in all your ways? All kinds of things. You read through that, and then you go back to the beginning and you're like, lamentation over the king of Tyre? Huh? Almost doesn't make sense, does it? So why would the king of Tyre have a lament prophesied against him like this? Exactly. Just like the Babylonians, the king of Tyre was doing the devil's work. It's the exact same reason. Tyre is a very interesting city in the history of Israel. They are oftentimes allied, defensive wall that went around the landward side of the city, and they were they were they were unsiegeable because they had this deep water port. You could lay siege. The trick of a siege is that when you lay siege to a city, you shut the city off from getting anything from the outside, right? They can't get food. They can't get more weapons. They can't get trade. They can't sell the stuff they have. They can't get water. And you lay siege to the city. You don't even really have to do much of anything. You just encamp your army outside for a long, long time, out of bowshot range or catapult range or whatever. And you wait for the king of the city to get so hungry, he says, okay, we surrender. That's what you do. Well, how do you lay siege to a city with a big navy and a port? You can't. It's hard to do, and especially for the nations that dominated the Middle East. They were nations that had port opportunity out to like the Persian Gulf and out to the Indian Ocean, which leads ultimately to the Pacific. While Tyre is on the Mediterranean Sea, which, of course, as we all know, leads out to the Atlantic. So, how are you going to get your navy in a time when people didn't sail out of sight of land all the way down around Africa and up the coast in any kind of timely manner to come and attack a city like Tyre? And what are you going to encounter along the way, right? It just didn't happen. So a city like Tyre could sit with, guess what? All kinds of pride because they were unassailable effectively. Pride. So what kinds of descriptions are given to this guy in like verses 12 and 13? What kinds of things do we see in verse 12? How is he described? Yeah, a model of perfection, of full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. And then look at skip over for a second that you were in Eden, right? Look at this description of all these gems, these gemstones, and gold and all that. If you spent much time reading the Old Testament prophets, especially when they have a throne room theophany. So again, a theophany is appearance of God. They have a throne room vision of God where they see God sitting on his throne. It sounds a lot like this. That when the prophets have a vision and looking at God and they're like, boy, okay, so I'm looking at God. Let me describe to you how beautiful he is. Rainbow, clouds, angels singing, gold, precious metals, all over the place. That's how they describe God. They picture the most beautiful things that they can think of and say, God's like all of that. And that's what God says effectively, in maybe a slightly lesser way, that this being once looked, clothed in a divine, I'll say clothed in a divine radiance. That's how he looked. And he was in Eden. And did you catch this? Did you catch this in verse 14? Well, so let's put those descriptions, and then this divine radiance. Verse 14. Look what God says of this being. You were an anointed guardian cherub. An anointed guardian cherub. What's the Hebrew word for anointed? Messiah. Messiah, the anointed one. Set apart for a specific purpose, a specific job. That's what anointed means. You're set apart for a specific job. And Messiah is used all over the place in the Old Testament, by the way. Every time a king is anointed, Messiah, the judges, the term gets used in there. If they're anointed prophets, the word gets used. It's used all over the place. So think of it as a small m, Messiah, lowercase m, Messiah. And so he's anointed. He has a special role. And remember when we were talking about the types of angels, the cherubim, a cherub, was one of those types. And it was a funky word because Hebrew scholars struggle with what the root of that word is, and they don't really know. And so they sort of kind of lean to this word that means to call out, in the sense of calling out for battle. And so that's why, like in Genesis, when the cherub, the flaming sword is placed in the hand of the cherubim at the entrance to the Garden of Eden. God doesn't send just any old kind of angel down there. He sends a warrior angel down there to guard to guard the Garden of Eden. It's not a 3-year-old with a flaming sword down there, potentially dangerous, but unlikely really knowing what to do. No, we're talking about a warrior trained in battle who knows exactly what to do with that flaming sword. And it's in your best interest to not cross him, right? Don't do it. It's bad. So that we begin to see that this being, if this is about the devil, and I tend to think that it is, was once set aside, special purpose, guardian, in the Garden of Eden, a cherub, beautiful to behold. And then we see in verses 16 and 17, well, you can even see it in 15. You were blameless in all your ways from the day you were created until unrighteousness was found in you. What? Unrighteousness? What kind? In the abundance of your trade, you were filled with violence in your midst, and you sinned. So that this utterly beautiful being, perfect in all of its ways, was filled with violence, and the result was sin. So I cast you as a profane thing from the mountain of God, and I destroyed you, O guardian cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. So verses 16 and 17, what was the result? What is his result from verses 16 and 17? Right, the result is his fall. And how does that fall? What is the result of his fall? It's like specifically, what is the fall? What does that fall mean? Yeah, right. So we have, number one, we are subjected to that sin. He's cast as a profane thing. So does anybody know what profane means? We tend to think that profane means dirty, right? We tend to think that profane means dirty. But actually it means worse than dirty. Because if it's dirty, then it's kind of special because it's dirty, right? But profane means common. Common, regular, nothing special. So think about this, right? We see, can we see the pride in here again, like we saw before? You were so special. You were beautiful like nothing else. And now you're just normal. You're just common. You're just regular. At least, right? At least if he could be special, super beautiful, wouldn't it be great if he'd be like, well, at least I still have something if he was super hideous, right? Frightening, dreadful to look upon. But no, it's profane. You're just common. All your beauty, all your glitz stripped away. And now you're just common. You're just profane. Nothing is worse, I think, for a person of pride to be unnoticeable. Right? Real consequences. So we have that the result, so that in 16 and 17, we see that he's been filled with evil. And the result that we see is that he gets cast down and made normal, made profane. And then now what he does, right? Now he's leading others into evil, right? He's exposed before kings. And they feast their eyes upon him. And then ultimately, as we look, what is his end? Oh, I beg your pardon. I forgot. I failed to mention in verse 18. by the multitude of your iniquities, in the unrighteousness of your trade, right? He's not simply unrighteous in and of himself. He's doing something with it. He's in his trade. And that echoes what was also said in verse 16. In the abundance of your trade, you were filled with violence in your midst and you sinned. There's a back and forth with trade, right? A back and forth, giving something and receiving something. In the multitude, verse 18, in the multitudes of your iniquities, in the unrighteousness of your trade, you profaned your sanctuaries. Why would this evil one have sanctuaries? Sanctuary is a holy place. That's what it means, holy place. For those who used to follow, they would be sanctuaries. Okay, I see what you're saying. So that they are holy places to the common, to the profane thing. This profane and holy are opposites. Holy is set apart, and profane is common. What if, we remember, he's a cherub. He's not just any cherub, he's a guardian cherub. He's a warrior, a guardian warrior. What does a guardian do? But he guards places. The only places, you don't guard common places, you guard special places. And holy is basically just the Bible word for special, for set apart. Holy place, sanctuary, a set apart place, a special place. The very places that the cherub guarded, he has now profaned. Can you think of any special holy place in the Bible that was profaned by the devil? Garden of Eden. We're getting some really important hints here as to the fall of the devil. And so then we see in verse 18, so I brought fire out from your midst, it consumed you, and I turned you to ashes on the earth in the sight of all who saw you. What would it mean to be turned to ashes? Dirty, right? Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Death, uncleanliness. This very creature that was perfection, now to come in contact with him is ashes. And then finally, of course, as his end is described in verses 18 through 19, you see fire mentioned, fire that consumes him, and people being appalled, disgusted. You have come to a dreadful end and shall be no more forever. So once he was a forever being, and ultimately he will be a no longer forever being. We breezed through that a lot faster than I thought that we would. Yes, Tony, have a question. Yeah, what a great question. So Tony's asking a question about verse 12, where verse 12, God's states, "Son of man, raise a lamentation over the king of Tyre." And we all recognize that "Son of man" is a way that is the most predominant way that Jesus refers to himself. He calls himself Son of Man over and over again. And so Tony's question is Jesus the one giving this basically, is Jesus the one speaking? So Jesus uses the term Son of Man to speak about himself, I think, for a very important reason. Number one, Jesus deflects, he doesn't lie, but he deflects that he is the Messiah very often. One of the, boy, we're going to saddle up this bunny rabbit on this one. There's this, when I was in seminary, maybe in college too, we called it the Messianic secret. If you read the Gospels, think about how often Jesus tells the people that he heals or casts demons out of to tell no one what he's done. And that if, and like when he's called the Son of God or he's called the Messiah, Jesus sort of silences it, he quiets it. And so there's this teaching called the Messianic secret. If Jesus had come out and said, "I'm the Son of God, I'm the Messiah," people would have had they had very distinct preconceived notions about what the Messiah was supposed to do and who the Messiah was supposed to be. And one of those things was that he was supposed to be a political war leader. He was supposed to ascend to the throne of David, restart the kingdom of Israel, cast off all foreign oppression, and start a brand new reign of the kingdom of Israel, a glorious reign of the kingdom of Israel. So let me tell you a little bit about Bill. Bill likes to read fantasy novels. And while Bill was in college, this fantastic fantasy series came out that was written by Jordan. Can't remember his first name now. Jordan is the guy's last name. And it was a long series. Took the guy 20 years to write it. He actually died before the series was completed. And another author that he'd kind of coached, he knew he was dying. He coached the author, gave the author all of his notes, finished the series for him. In the series, then one of the things that Jordan does in the series is he takes a number of mythologies that we have on Earth, or regular human that we currently have mythologies, and he kind of mished them all up together. And the fantasy theme that he went with was that history repeats itself, time repeats itself, old things become new and they become old, and over again. And so that ultimately he had like a reincarnation theme that went, the heroes that lived in the past become the heroes of the present, and they'll one day be the heroes of the future, sort of thing. One of the figures, the main figure in his series, is a guy that's basically a Messiah figure. It's very evident that he's a Christ figure, right down to at the end. If you haven't read it, I'm sorry, but it's been out for like 40 years now, or 30 years. You could have read it at any time. Right down to dying and rising. And once people figure out that he's the dragon, that's what the hero is called in this, is the dragon. He's the dragon reborn. All over the place, rebel groups pop up, and they call themselves the people of the dragon, and they cause all kinds of problems around the countryside, not just for the current rulers in this world, but also for the hero of the story himself, because they're doing all kinds of outrageous stuff in his name. Over and over again. Now we come back to the Bible. We get rid of the fantasy literature and what Bill does in his free time, and we'd look in the Bible, or in the history of the Bible. Right around the time of Jesus, there were several Messiah figures that rose up, and they claimed to be the Messiah. And when they did, people flocked to them. There were what we would today call terrorist activities that went on in their name, and it was a great big mess until the Romans would send in the army and destroy cities and towns, the innocent and the guilty, right next to one another, and reestablish Roman rule. So Jesus does not go around saying, Son of God, I'm the Messiah, because if he did, all kinds of little cells would have popped up claiming to be following him and committing acts of violence in his name. And Jesus, during his reign, his walk on earth, is not a violent actor. Jesus does not carry out violence. Book of Revelation, excessively violent, right? There's a lot of violence, Book of Revelation. But at that time, that was not Jesus's thing, because Jesus was not establishing a kingdom according to people's preconceived notions. So he's trying to steer clear of those preconceived notions. Number two, Son of Man is not just a term that's used in Ezekiel and in Daniel, but it also pops up in other places as well. Son of Man, very much like C.S. Lewis grabs a hold of in the Chronicles of Narnia series. Son of Man means human being. Human being. Jesus is drawing attention to the fact that he is a human being. And if you consider the conversation we had a couple of Sundays ago, talking about that Jesus didn't cheat in his faithfulness to God, right? He didn't cheat. His divine nature had to submit itself to his human nature. It could not overshadow and therefore cheat by healing, or cheat by knowledge, or cheat by righteousness. He had to suppress that divine nature so that as a human being, as a man, he would rely upon the Holy Spirit. That's what we talked about several weeks ago. We had a bunny trail lesson that day. And so he says, Son of Man, to point out that he's human, and also that in those cases, like in the book of Daniel, when there's one that is prophesied that is coming, it's described, he appeared like a son of man. He's drawing attention to that for anybody that's paying attention. I'm the one coming on the clouds. Wake up. Drawing attention to that by using that same kind of phrase. So here, I think what you see is God is speaking to Ezekiel, and he's saying Son of Man, which is thematically no different than him saying man, or hey you, or human being to Ezekiel. It seems different to us because we're looking back through a lens of where Jesus is calling himself Son of Man, but that lens does not exist for Ezekiel. Does that make sense? Cool. All right, I think we're going to stop there. And man, please hang on to this stuff in your noodle about that the devil being in the garden, about this fall, about profaning sanctuaries. Hold on to that for next week. And next week, we're going to look at some really cool fall and creation stuff. Let me close us in a word of prayer. Father, thank you very much for today. Thank you for this opportunity to get together and study and begin to see some of these texts that lie behind who the enemy is. And Father, I pray that you would open our minds, open our hearts, help us to understand, help us to see, God, oh Lord, help us to see the dangers of pride, and that we will not fall into the enemy's snare. In Jesus' name, amen.